All right, thanks for coming, everybody. I'll just do a quick introduction. My name's Chris Williams. Some of you may know me. I'm a professor here in the Associate Dean for External Relations and Knowledge Exchange. And we're running a Masterclass series. I think this is the 5th one so far as part of the New School for Business and Society. And we've had lots of different interesting perspectives so far, such as why do the Japanese work themselves to death, and a day in the life of a Jet2 pilot. So we've got something very interesting today. Tristram Hicks has come all the way from France.
Brighton.
Brighton, all right. To be with us. I'm really looking forward. An international criminal justice lawyer, former New Scotland Yard detective. And we're hosted today thanks to Slobodan Tomic, professor here at the school, hosting this today, who's an expert in public management, public policy, particularly in bureaucracy and integrity, right? Yeah. So thanks very much for doing this, and really looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thank you for coming over. Yes, so the occasion is an interesting book. Shall I say just first, it's part of the Masterclass series, but also co-organized with RegNat, which is a newly founded interdepartmental group of scholars interested in specializing in regulation and regulatory governance. So colleagues Catherine Wright from law school and Eva Himes, which was online, Eva, and myself. So and a group of scholars, I can see some of them here present. Thanks for coming. A co-organized event. So if you have any question, if you want to join the group, please get in touch. We have events. We do events every month, basically, in the next 3 months. We'll have either presentations, visiting lectures, and so on. So please do get in touch. So now it's my great pleasure to welcome Tristram Hicks. And the occasion is obviously the book launch. Thanks for coming over. Tristram has a wealth of experience in anti-money laundering consultancy, international experience from all over the world. So I'm happy that we'll have the opportunity to discuss with him, his views and also his arguments and put forward in the book. How to proceed further with the reform of the anti-money laundering system, the global system of regulation. Right. Okay, so shall we start by letting Tristram read three quick readings from the book and give 3 pieces of statistics, right?
Indeed, yes.
And I think that would be a good way to start. It's the Waterstones method.
Well, thanks, Slobodan. Thanks, Chris, for this opportunity. And a little bit about me. I graduated from Berwick College in 1981. This was all fields where we're sat now. In fact, all of these buildings, apart from the boiler room, all fields. So it's great to be back. And after I left Derwent, I travelled around a bit and then joined the police in 1985, spent 12 years fighting crime in South London. The next 12 years fighting serious organised crime at Yard. And for the final 10 years, I had the privilege of touring the world, advising governments and their agencies about how to fight the war on dirty money and how to recover assets from criminals, including those who committed regulatory breaches in that area between regulation and crime. So that's the privilege I've had. This is a book launch. So traditionally, you have to read from the book. So I'm going to do 3 readings and then some statistics. When I was a student here and I didn't have time to read books, I'd read the beginning and the end and try and work out what happened in between. I wouldn't recommend that if you're a student. But on this occasion, I'm going to read from the beginning of the book for about a minute, and then a bit from the middle, a bit at the end. So money is not the root of all evil, said the finance manager in the audience. It's the love of money that causes all the trouble. He was right, of course, and his contribution corrected all future presentations given by this author. There's nothing wrong with money itself. The evil comes from the bad behavior of people. The behavior is the evil that causes good money to be dirty and has done since biblical times and before. Nowadays, we use the word crime to describe evil in our national legislation across the world, and some lesser evils we describe as breaches of regulations. But they too create dirty money, and every year, millions of crimes and breaches of regulations generate billions of dollars. Evil may be a strong word, but crime kills people or causes irreparable harm to our lives, our bodies, even our dreams and ambitions. Enabling all this evil is money laundering, the crime of handling dirty money. So if you're not angry now, you should be. You and everyone you know is worse off than they could be. Your water, the very air you breathe, contains extra polluting particles that are there because someone, somewhere, broke an environmental rule to get some dirty money. There's no escape. Everything you see about you is tainted by money laundering. As I go through these readings, if you can think of questions that you might want to ask, because this is going to be a question and answer session. So this is from partway through the book. As an ex-police officer, I'm interested in police corruption. So the reason that police corruption is so important in the war on dirty money is that the normalisation of corrupt police on our public road allows endemic corruption to exist everywhere. Corrupt traffic police are a symbol of a lawless society. If the traffic police are corrupt, then what would be the point in calling their colleagues, with teachers selling exam results or doctors treating bribe payers ahead of other patients? If the police cannot deal with their own corrupt officers, how can they possibly be looked upon to deal with other corrupt professionals? This is aside from the issue of dealing with grand corruption, which is obviously quite beyond the capability of such a police force. Pause for thought though. If you were a corrupt president or a state governor, surely you would ensure that your police were under-resourced, undermined, and hopefully fully corrupt. Then you are safe. The relationship of the bent traffic cop by the side of the road and the corrupt president in his palace is symbiotic. And finally, we get to the end of the book where we imagine that we've won the war on dirty money. Different crime types, corruption, environmental crime, fraud, robbery, tax evasion, and so on, can all be tackled by the relevant subject matter experts. But it is the use of financial intelligence, investigation, and asset recovery, far from being a specialism which needs to be commonly applied. This requires applying an age-old adage: to catch a thief, you have to think like one, to a modern world awash with computer-enabled financial information and a modern criminal code that includes a flexible and generic crime called money laundering. Criminals think of ways to acquire and spend money. To succeed against them, we should apply financial tools. We think that this could change the current whack-a-mole problem, whereby scarce specialist subject matter experts concentrate on a crime type and succeed in suppressing it only to find that criminals have been displaced to another crime type. So those are the readings from the book. The style is intended to be accessible to an ordinary reader. And here are some three statistics to help put this in context. This is a global book covering a really wide area. The three statistics are these. The prevention side of anti-money laundering costs around $210 billion a year and rising. A couple £100 million since we're in the UK, but that's the global cost. Around about 1% of the dirty money available for confiscation is actually confiscated, although that statistic might be as small as 0.1%. It's a difficult area to study. And the third statistic is that in 80% of countries, convicted criminals keep the money of which they were convicted. So that's a reason for someone to write this book. And I felt that I could contribute to that. I should caveat all of those statistics. You'll appreciate that these are difficult statistics to be definitive about, but they're pretty good. And those people who produce them are prepared to justify how they've been arrived at. So those are reasons to write the book. I just want to define money laundering. The anti-money laundering regime has two halves: the prevention side and the enforcement side. And they use different definitions and actually have different budgets. They don't really talk to each other. And the theme of the book is that this doesn't really work because of that difference. But money laundering is really simple to understand. It's the handling of stolen property. And I just want to demonstrate how basic it is by stealing this apple over here. So, imagine this is a stolen apple, and in the book I go back to the story of Eve and Adam and the snake, and explain that Eve and Adam were told not to eat the fruit from the tree. And then Eve took the fruit. When she took it, knowing that she shouldn't, she's in acquisition of the proceeds of a crime, the crime being theft. She's an acquisition. She's acquired the proceeds of the crime. When she passes it to Adam, that's transferring the property, transferring the proceeds of crime to a person who's not down knows that it's stolen and that he shouldn't take it. So he commits the crime at the same time that I do. If you imagine a foreign border between us, incidentally, we commit the crime at the same moment. It's one of the very few crimes in the world which can be committed simultaneously in two different jurisdictions, which is very relevant to the war on dirty money. When they eat the apple, they hide or disguise the proceeds of crime, a third element in the offence. And meanwhile, the snake has been concerned in the arrangement throughout. So those are the elements of money laundering. So that's a crime that's been going on since the beginning of time. It's relevant now because society has made a couple of changes, recent changes, which created this war on dirty money. One was the mass consumption of drugs, particularly in America, which created a concern in the American government, and as a superpower, that influenced everybody else. So that created a concern about the fortunes being made. And the second thing was computers, which means we can now investigate money laundering in a way that we absolutely couldn't do before. Because in the old days, you could shred the paper and there'd be no record. As soon as you make a computer entry, then you've got it. If it's a transaction, the other party's got it. It's accessible to accountants and whistleblowers and people who maintain the computers, and it's saved forever, and it's in backups in foreign jurisdictions typically. So the Caribbean back up their jurisdictions into the United States of America for safety reasons. So it's actually backed up in another jurisdiction. These are all interesting aspects of the war on dirty money. And that's why, although it's an ancient crime that's integral to all crime where money is the objective, it's relevant to today because of these two major changes that have happened in our living memories quite recently. So that's the introduction.
Right. Okay, thanks. Can I just kind of kick off the questions session, right? Part of the launch. If I may ask 1 or 2 or 3 questions, and then you follow up, or if you have questions that you want to ask immediately, please let me know. So I think you partly kind of touched upon the question of why we should tackle money laundering, but I feel there is more to it. So playing the devil's advocate, why would we bother at all with laundered money again from criminal proceeds? So from a utilitarian perspective, there are those saying, well, that's income. It's good for the economy, especially if a country is a net recipient of laundered money. So, how would you respond to it?
And it's a fair question. There are ministers of finance who are on record to say, well, I want foreign direct investment. And actually, it's more important for me that I get that investment than it is to worry about crime taking place in some other country. Because I'm just getting the money. And why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem for the globe. And the problem is that when the money arrives, the dirty money arrives, it arrives with strings attached. Because the people who created the dirty money often come with it. And we end up in a situation where the dirty money and the behavior of the people who created that dirty money come into new jurisdictions. And we've created quite a lawless world in terms of crime moving around in our globalized environment, where breaches of regulations in one place create dirty money in another and harm worldwide. So this is a way to try and alter the behavior of bad people. And as I started by saying, the dirty money comes from a lot of crime. The Financial Action Task Force, which has set the standard for regulations and anti-money laundering, has listed 21 crimes, all the crimes that you could think, where the purpose is dirty money. So there's a lot of crime at stake that we're trying to fix. Can I just say, the co-author of this book, who lives in New Zealand, is watching us on Zoom. So, hi, Nick. Welcome.
Nicholas Gilmore, I was just going to say,
yeah,
we should mention
acknowledge his effort.
Yeah, give part of the credit. Right. Okay. Thanks. So basically, negative effects, fostering crime, and so on. Now, the book focuses on the global regulatory regime, and the main argument is basically it's broken or it's not as effective as it should be, and they set out a range of measures that may be taken to improve to fix the system. Now, I'm just wondering, so looking at back, so how the regime started and evolved. Can you tell us more about the defining moments or so-called focusing events, shock events that played a role in development of the regime, and to what extent they've shaped the current state of the regime?
Okay. So I think I'll begin in 1989, and the OECD held a meeting where they were concerned about two things. One was drug money, narcotics, coming into America, and the other one was stated to be tax evasion, particularly of American taxes. And they tasked a group of people to go and examine the problem, and they came back and said, well, actually, it's not just drugs. Turns out there's lots of crimes which are done for the purpose of dirty money, and they came up with 21 crime types covering all the crimes you can think of where money is the goal. And that group became the Financial Action Task Force, which is hosted by the OECD. They're still based in Paris, and there are now a number of regional FATF-style bodies around the world which evaluate countries all over the world and have been doing for 30 years. And it's grown into quite a substantial industry in terms of evaluating all of the jurisdictions in the world to check that they are complying with some regulations which were first created in 1990 by the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. And those evaluation reports report on all countries in the world. And it's a substantial industry, and it's the best picture we've got of the global trajectory is that there is the FATF. They're good evaluations, they are robust, and no one else is doing it. So we simply don't know what's going on without their work. So that's kind of the origins. And for the first thing they discovered that was money laundering isn't a crime. So they had to create money laundering as a crime in all 200 jurisdictions. Then they created something called financial intelligence units, where the banking sector can report their suspicions of customers to a government entity, a financial intelligence unit, for passing on to law enforcement. And they also set up committees in each country to oversee that process. And that took basically 20 years. And the hope was that those three constructs would control the regulations, ensure the compliance to anti-money laundering regulations, and that would lead to a reduction in money laundering. After 20, and that's a major achievement, doing those things. After 20 years, they then realized it wasn't really working. So off their own bat, without a shock, they reformed the methodology and started to look at operational effectiveness, particularly of criminal justice, and how that worked in terms of enforcing those who commit crimes and commit egregious breaches of regulations. So we've got 200 jurisdictions where the battles are taking place in this war, and some are winning and some are losing. The executive secretary of the FATF is quoted as saying some are doing badly and others are doing worse than others. So even he was saying there is an issue with this. And within those countries, there have been successes, but there's also been shocks. So things that have driven things forward, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy in the United States created the RICO legislation about racketeering and allowed asset recovery, essentially during the 1970s for the first time. The assassination of Veronica Guerin in Ireland and two police officers in 1997 created a shock that created the Proceeds of Crime Act in Ireland, on which our own Proceeds of Crime Act in the UK is based. And the assassination of Falcone and Chiesa in Italy created the anti-mafia legislation in Italy. So unfortunately, things are event-driven in this war on dirty money. And at the moment, we have a war in the Ukraine, which is putting this subject high on the agenda, because people are realizing that Russian money is impacting in the world, and not enough is being done about it. So it's put this on the agenda, and in 10 years' time, there will be another shock. And this subject is driven by events that might sound dull. So building regulations, perhaps not the most exciting regulatory area. But let's think about that, and then think about an earthquake in Turkey. And suddenly it brings on a whole new perspective. And dirty money is at the core of that. The excess number of tragic deaths directly as a result, it is said, of breaching building regulations and corruption. And there will be another disaster next month. So this is happening all the time, and we can do something about it, and we're not doing enough.
Thanks. So I can see, down the line in the next 10, 15 years, it will be an increasingly prominent topic, right? And related from a regulatory perspective, I guess, a whole range of issues are related to the way anti-corruption institutions, anti-money laundering collaborate with regulatory agencies. So, and I guess we can talk a bit more about that later on. But I'll open the floor to questions from the audience, and then later on I'll follow up with a few more questions. Sir.
Can I just ask you, sorry, you mentioned about the Ukraine and Russian money, but is that Russian state money being misused, or is that in some other forms and corrupt criminality? Unless you can differentiate between the Russian state money and And so what you were referring to there, that money coming
Okay.
to
So-
Ukraine.
Okay, so the allegations are that oligarchs who got rich after the Soviet break then invested in the West, and some people say that the money has illegal origins, and we have a power in the United Kingdom, for example, of unexplained wealth orders. One of the issues with Russian money is that the wealth isn't actually unexplained. It's just impossible to prove the circumstances of that money. But what I'm saying is that the flow of money, which is suspect, and other people are saying that it's suspect, is something which is creating a potential problem in the places where oligarchs have invested in.
There was a hand up over there, yeah.
So you mentioned earlier the story of the corrupt police officer. I work a lot in the African payment ecosystem.
Yeah.
And I've seen a lot of culture that is normal. And I'm curious, where do you think we're headed to in that direction? And this is a stronger together story, and how you can't change culture overnight. Do you see any comments and future, any little signals of talking about that?
Yes, I do. For the benefit of Zoom, I should be repeating these questions. So, in summary, the lady's asking about the issue of corrupt police officers in Africa, in particular, and I would add to it Asia and South America. Yeah, and I've worked a lot in Africa as well. And there's a clash of issues about the prevailing culture and how the law actually works. What I would say though is that those traffic cops are actually, it might be a cultural thing that's happening, but that doesn't mean that it's accepted. I mean, it's not wanted by the people who are being taxed by the traffic cops, who aren't actually making the roads safe. And some countries have taken action against the traffic cops in order to fight against corruption at a higher level. There's also an issue about those cops picking on women and the poor, as you may know. So there's an element of undesirable culture inequality, both between the genders and between inequality of people who are wealthy, who don't get taxed so much as those who are poor. Yes, it can be addressed. And I would look at Kenya as an example, where their anti-corruption commission has focused on those traffic cops. And they've dealt with grand corruption as well. So there is a focus on it. And I can tell you those anti-corruption officers want to address the problem and have succeeded in addressing the problem in some places. I don't think we do enough when we're looking at anti-corruption to look at the fact that we used to, in this country, tax motorists, traffic cops in the 60s and 70s, did that in the UK, in France and Spain, and now the statistics say that they don't. And we should look at how that problem is resolved, because my experience of traveling the globe for the last 10 years is that cops are cops all over the world, prosecutors are the same all over the world, judges are the same all over the world. They work in very different legal frameworks, but they're the same type of people. And we can, if we alter the legal frameworks, then we can address these common problems, because a traffic cop taxing someone on a road in Spain is exactly the same as someone doing it in Africa. Actually, you can fix it the same way.
Andrew, hi.
Currencies can change the playing field quite drastically. How is that sort of going to go away from you even further?
Okay, well, cryptocurrencies, if you wish to gamble on cryptocurrencies, then I think you should appreciate that you're taking a gamble. And actually, you don't buy anything with cryptocurrencies, you buy it with fiat currencies once you've done the change. So the technology side of things is interesting. And it's not just crypto, it's also the AI side of things, and fungible tokens that you can also buy if you're of a gambling bent. And technology is good to improve, to make things, systems quicker and cheaper, like blockchain currency. Blockchain technology is an excellent thing to do something quicker and cheaper than you could before. But actually, the book talks about broken systems. And if you've got broken systems, making them operate quicker and cheaper to do something that doesn't really work, it doesn't really help. So we actually need to think about the systems. Personally, I think cryptocurrency, which is your question, is a distraction from money laundering, because cryptocurrency is property in the same way that an apple is property. And so we apply different techniques to it, but ultimately it's property, and if it derives from a crime or criminal behaviour, then it's dirty money. Keep it simple to reply to that.
We have a couple of questions on Zoom. So we've got Mark Wilkinson. Hi, Mark. As you mentioned with electronic payments, there is a tracking that can be done. Why do governments create large denomination physical notes which purely fuel the dirty money market and make transactions largely invisible?
It's an excellent question. And I think cryptocurrency is a distraction from cash. And we talk again and again in the book about the fact that you can still cross a border and go and buy a house for cash. You struggle to do it in the United Kingdom, but you can do it a whole load of other places. And why do governments have high denomination notes? Well, it seems, and we talk about this in the book, that the only people who use cash in those high denominations are governments and criminals and banks. And yet, in the UK, a cashless society, even now a quarter of all the confiscated money is cash, which is incredible when you think about it. And if you look at the case of NatWest, who were convicted of anti-money laundering breaches, the breach concerned a 10-year period where one customer paid in £264 million in cash into one branch of NatWest. And as a result, they were convicted and fined. £264 million, incidentally. And you can see the justice that was delivered there. Because clearly they didn't make that amount of profit, but the turnover matched the fine. So cash is really important. I cannot explain why governments persist in issuing high denomination notes. There isn't a satisfactory explanation.
Great, thank you. A couple more questions online. Ruxandra, hi Ruxandra. Do you believe that large MNEs looking to do business in developing economies have a responsibility in tackling money laundering?
I think everybody's got a responsibility to tackle money laundering is the short answer. Why developing countries would be right back at you. But yeah, everybody has a duty. I think that one of the areas about developing countries is that because they have fragile institutions or young institutions, they're less able to respond to breaches of regulations and breaches of money laundering, and that's why they're vulnerable.
So I'm not going to second guess what Ruxandra's thinking, but should it be part of the MNE's international CSR strategy, or should it be a separate part of their strategy? Where do you see that fitting within, I don't know, Heineken or Unilever or P&G?
Well, I think one of the issues, and I'm going to be given a bleak answer to this, the Financial Action Task Force evaluates countries. What it doesn't do is evaluate the illicit financial flows, or indeed any financial flows, between countries. So if we were talking about cross-border investment and cross-border policy, The FATF doesn't evaluate the flows of money between countries, and that we see as a weakness in the area. So I think it's up to the FATF to look at and evaluate illicit financial flows or financial flows to see if they are illicit when they're doing evaluations. And we recommend this in the book because the way we see it, the evaluations do a snapshot of a particular country every 8 to 10 years, which is not often enough. And the problem is actually the flow of money between countries through those mechanisms. And we think that's a weakness in the system. And an adjacent answer, when we consider tax evasion, there isn't a crime of international tax evasion. It doesn't exist. You can only evade tax in a jurisdiction, and it's a crime in that jurisdiction. So again, we're simply missing flow of evaded tax from one jurisdiction to another, and that is a huge problem in the war on dirty money, in that one crime type of tax.
So let's take Heineken delivering crates of beer in DRC,
Okay.
and the roadblock economy. And I'm not going to second guess what Heineken would say, but imagine it's a distributor of a distributor of a distributor, right, who pay the cash to the 12-year-old with the AK-47.
Yeah.
You get what I'm saying? You know, what can Heineken do about that? Should they do anything about it?
Yeah, that's a different question. I really have to think about it.
Yeah, okay.
It's not something.
Just tying it back into.
Yeah.
By the way, Roxandra's one of my co-authors, and we published a paper on Heineken in that.
Okay, I'll give it some thought. Happy to.
One more from the room. We've got one more online. Yeah, lady at the back on the left. Hi.
Thanks for your talk. This is a bit of a lawyering question, but you mentioned the definition of money laundering being different for prevention and enforcement. I wondered if that had any impact on effectiveness across jurisdictions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your question. So repeat it for the record. The lady's asking about the significance of having different money laundering definitions. And I've talked about the crime definition as specified in the United Nations Conventions, which is the one about it being property derived from crime directly or indirectly. The prevention side deal with a definition which is all about placement, layering, and integration, which is the mechanism whereby money is disguised within the banking system. And that's used in training the 85,000 members of ACAMS, which is the Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists. It's used by the people who are spending that $210 billion a year on the prevention side of things. They use that definition. And perhaps let's say they identify some integration. And they report that to law enforcement who go, what does that even mean? Is it property that's been derived directly or indirectly from crime? Whether it's integrated or placed or layered makes no difference to how law enforcement deal with it. So it leads to a fundamental misunderstanding between the two halves of the regime. And yes, it has a huge impact on efficiency because we've got one half working to a different definition, which doesn't actually meet the points to prove by the crime enforcers. And you could say it's actually lost in translation. That's where the war has been lost. And to add to that, we've also decided, having created this United Nations definition, that goes to individual countries who then rewrite it into their own criminal code, add something about organised crime, or that it should only be serious crime, or it should only be where the sentence is more than a year, whatever their local definition is. So they create a different offence, slightly different. Then they translate it back into English for the purpose of international treaties with their other countries who are also working with translated offences, which are ever so slightly different. So when the countries want to cooperate, they've actually got definitions which are very nearly the same, but not quite. Which means that, as you will understand from a lawyer perspective, it doesn't work. because lawyers will unpick every word in a definition, and because they have to meet their own requirements. And I tell a story in the book how the Albanians were seeking the assistance of the German authorities to try and find the crimes that had taken place in Germany and the proceeds of crime were in Albania. And the Albanians made a request, and they said, well, this is a serious crime in our country. And the Germans looked up their crime code, and their crime code said in English, well, this is a grave crime, and therefore we can't assist, because those are two different words. And it's just because the translator in the two countries, at the time when they wrote the protocols, had used different words. And that has a serious impact. In that case, the inquiries went on for 18 months before that simple translation error was discovered. And that's absolutely typical of what goes on.
Okay, we've got another one online. Eva, hi Eva, Eva Himes. Related to the previous question, I think she's talking about Mark Wilkinson's question about large denomination notes, but Eva, correct me if I'm wrong. Related to the previous question, which role do multinational banks play in the regime in practice? Are they helping to fight, or are they enabling money laundering?
Well, we encourage the banks to comply with the regulations, and that's what the Financial Action Task Force is doing, and the regulators are imposing huge fines. But we are definitely not doing enough about cash and the handling of cash by banks. But it is up to law enforcement ultimately, because at the very beginning I said it's not money that's the problem, it's the pursuit of money and how financial intelligence tells you you can do something about it. So a €500 note on its own, there's nothing wrong with that. It's not illegal in itself. So we need to work together to get that information from the banking sector to law enforcement to see whether we actually have a problem. And the book talks about that chain of events being broken, that the suspicious activity reports, of which there are tens of thousands produced, 34 million in the world, and the vast majority of those get to the financial intelligence units, which are government entities, independent government entities, but they don't get as far as law enforcement for reasons that really are unclear. So I'm not going to blame the banks in this, because really we're looking at an enforcement process that doesn't deliver justice to the banks, who are busy reporting these suspicious transactions, and actually they should be.
Okay, Eva, I hope you got that answer. Okay, anybody else in the room?
You talked about the challenges once you get to the suspicious activity reports and investigating and then prosecuting and then collection of the assets at the end of the process.
Yeah.
So every stage there's a bottleneck which knocks that down, so you get smaller and smaller percentage at the end that you do actually manage to do something about. But right at the beginning, how effective are the large corporates and any corporate who should be producing those suspicious activity reports? How effective are the banks in the streets at actually identifying these things in the first place?
That is an interesting question. I mean, they're spending an enormous amount of money, and as I said, there's 85,000 members of these specialists, and I think that at one point I was the single point of contact receiving suspicious reports for London. So I can't remember how many tens of thousands it was, and actually the reports were pretty good, but you can't tell because it's only one half of the needle. They can only do so much because the other half of the needle, they've got the suspicious money side, and I've got the information about crimes and criminals. That's the other half of the needle. And you put the two together and the needle falls out of the haystack. Unless you put them together, then you don't have the needle in the haystack. The task of a money launderer is very simple. They've just got to keep the information about crime separate from the information about the money. So the simple form of money laundering, two robbers go into a bank and steal some money, go to the bank next door and pay it in, and they don't mention where it's come from. And that's it. That's all the money launderer has to do. And so the task of the anti-money launderer is to link the information about the suspicious reports with the information about crimes and criminals. The financial intelligence units have got the suspicious reports from the banks, which may or may not be good. We can't tell until we've linked it with the information that crime and criminals held by police and prosecutors. I don't think there's enough feedback coming from police and prosecutors to help the banks identify and create a virtuous circle of good practice. So there's not enough information, not enough people on the police and enforcement side to provide the critical information back to the banking sector. So once again, I'm blaming governments for this.
Yeah, I just, one thing that you said about states where corruption is sort of wrong, you have under-resourcing as a key part of that. One thing that made me reflect on is sort of going wider than law enforcement to other bodies or other professions. So things like auditors. So where you have auditors, if you have a sort of state auditor body or requirement that certain activities are audited, have you found in your sort of global experience that sort of either of those modes is preferable, I suppose? Also, when we look at the failures of some of the big auditing firms in recent years, are auditors, I suppose, part of the solution in terms of prevention, or are they potentially in some cases part of the problem, or is it a bit of both?
Well, they're potentially part of the solution, and the national auditing body ought to be part of that committee I was talking about that's addressing anti-money laundering. Typically, they are providing that, and sometimes the auditing body is connected with the Anti-Corruption Commission in various countries. So they're absolutely potentially part of the solution. Yeah.
Have you ever seen any where it's the other side that where they're actually part in terms of auditing firms being used to actually cover up trails of where sort of private auditing requirements are imposed, for example?
Yes, I think it can be a problem. Yeah.
Like, could I just, because that's a very good, interesting point.
Yeah.
Because what you could then have, as we understand that there are within solicitors, there are dishonest solicitors who are called upon by serious organised crime people to deal with their defence.
Yeah.
And I think that surely could be the same for some auditing people who can fall onto the wrong side of integrity, if you like.
Yes.
So therefore, but how does law enforcement, it's over time perhaps, but how does law enforcement identify them as well?
Okay, so we use a broad term called enablers to cover the accounting and legal professions. And we do have a global problem in that it's not in every country that they're required to report suspicious transactions. So sometimes accountants and lawyers are excluded from the transaction. Now, and I do think that's a global problem. I think it's up to the FATF to encourage countries to ensure that those enablers are required to make those reports. And in my experience, suspicious transaction reports by lawyers in particular are the gold of that kind of information. So the potential is actually very great, and we don't do enough globally to put accountants and lawyers on the spot. That is for sure. And this is about, when I come to accountants, I do think there's an issue about accounting standards in relation to tax, because there's an accounting standard to say that they ought to ensure that transactions have a commercial purpose. But if the purpose is outside of a normal tax arrangement, there's no accounting standard to talk about that. And I do think there's more that could be done by accountants to change the way tax is avoided. And we do have a chapter within the book talking about the issue of tax evasion and tax avoidance. And the point of international tax evasion is that it's not a crime, as I've said before, but we now have, in this globalized world, we have structures of companies organized across borders, transferring money and transferring ideas within an accounting context, that if they took place in one jurisdiction, would actually be a crime. And they take place across multiple jurisdictions so that they're legal in any one jurisdiction. And actually, we're not doing enough to get to the bottom of that issue. When I talk about tax evasion and tax avoidance, we have tax enforcers operating at a national level. And actually what we need is to look at those circumstances from a crime point of view and to bring some different professions together. And the successes we've had in the war on dirty money are where we've got multiple agencies working together. For example, in the Irish Criminal Assets Bureau, our own asset recovery teams in the United Kingdom, but note that we don't have a national one, we just have regional ones. And that's where we've brought tax people and police officers and trading standards together. And I think there's room for environmental agencies and for regulatory bodies to work within those multi-agency environments. And part of my consultancy role has been to encourage that around the world, because that's how we can make some progress.
Could that be something that the National Crime Agency could take a role in, a central role from a policing perspective?
The book is a global book, so I would argue that the regional asset recovery teams actually provide a global example, and you can do this. And I think we could do better in the United Kingdom if we expanded the regional team to be a national team as well. But the NCA would probably come back and say, we do that already.
We have a question, Lydia Ebden, who simply says, question, don't we need an entirely new and better system?
And this is a good question. Personally, my experience of organizations is that if you create a new organization, then you create a whole load of new problems. And you don't find out you created the problems until about 5 years it's taken place. If it's a global organization, then it's going to take even longer before those problems manifest. So I'm in favour of building on success, and I'm saying that the Financial Action Task Force has been successful at much of what it's done. It's created the crime, it's created the organisational infrastructure, it's created the evaluation process. These are all things that took 30 years to create. We absolutely shouldn't throw them away. But what we could do is make them better. So Nicholas and I have written a book which is all about solutions. The whole book is divided into chapters, which are actually on the model of the evaluation process. So anybody familiar with that will see the order we worked through, the criteria that the FATF use when it's setting standards. At the end of each chapter is a solutions toolbox. Now, people can take or leave those solutions, but it's intended to be a book of solutions because we're actually quite optimistic. The people I go around the world and meet, many people want to solve the problem. They want to make it better. They're not all bad people. They're not all corrupt. There are lots of good people who simply don't know how to fix this. So in each area, we try to find solutions, some of which are easy, some of which are a bit more complicated. But in each area, there are potential solutions for people to think about. And the book covers the globe and all kinds of crime and all kinds of regulations. So we're dealing with quite a lot. But I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and translation issues that we could actually fix quite easily. So no, I don't want to create a whole new system, but I do want a new narrative.
Okay, Lydia's got a follow-up. So can we take Lydia's follow-up before we come to you? So Lydia, follow-up question. Haven't we lost the battle? Sorry, this is quite a long question. It's on the screen behind you as well. I used to own and run an accountancy practice. I am so glad I run it no longer.
The government has made it very difficult indeed for me to take on clients. One example is the forgiveness without question of people who fraudulently took COVID grants. The fraud was criminal, but the government forgave it. It leaves clients and potential clients seeing some types of fraud as not really criminal.
Okay, I mean, it's a bit of a specific national question, and this is a global book, but since I was in the fraud squad, I feel that I should chip in with something here. There is an issue about economic crime in the United Kingdom, and this is a common issue across the world. Could we call it economic crime, or financial crime, or white-collar crime, or some term like that, or we call it fraud? And as soon as we do that, we cut off a whole raft of interest in the criminal justice system. It doesn't like fraud, it doesn't want to do fraud. It was delighted when fraud ceased to be on the political agenda back in the late 90s and the early 2000s. So my experience is that if we're going to address a crime issue, then we have to get the crime enforcers on board, law enforcement and prosecutors. And as soon as we call it economic crime, then we're turning a long history of not wanting to address economic crime. So we need to put it in different terms. I think it's useful to talk about the proceeds of crime and confiscation. And I think incentivization worked in the United Kingdom. I think it's now gone a little off the rails, but that's a national issue. But if we're going to use the resources we've got to the best, then we need everybody in law enforcement to do something about proceeds of crime. And if we approach common crime issues using financial investigation and financial intelligence, my experience is that it's better, quicker, and cheaper if we approach it from that angle. Start with the dirty money, and then bring in the subject matter expert who knows about drug dealing or human trafficking or fraud in order to provide the evidence for that particular crime, but deal with the proceeds of crime through money laundering as a technique, and to bring law enforcement on board with that idea. Because we haven't yet convinced, in narrative terms, law enforcement, and I mean this in the widest sense across the world, we haven't convinced them that economic crime is actually a problem they should address. They think it's a problem for auditors, they think it's a problem for anti-corruption commissions, they don't think it's their problem. They're not engaged in the war on dirty money because no one's put it in narrative terms that they understand. And this is a very good example of how we have failed in our government narrative to address a particular issue.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Lydia. Thank you.
My problem was more in that global context. I worked a lot in the private sector, and the compliance is seen as a tick box. You've got to do all these people do things which happen to us on. I worked also with regulators, and I've worked with the development sector and government agencies around this in this financial vision space. I'm curious, who is the audience of your book? Who would you love the audience of your book to be? The private sector, public sector, government?
Well, of course, I want everybody to buy it.
Solutions are like goodman system, or all these things need to work together, I guess.
It is directed at everybody because I'm trying to change the narrative about how we talk about these things. And so I talked about corruption, and I've approached it from a law enforcement angle. But actually, everybody's involved, and I'm really talking about the enforcement side is not doing justice to all the other parties, private sector, public sector, and the public in general. The enforcement side is not being taken seriously, and we've ended up in quite a lawless environment because of that. So I think that's a policy issue to connect enforcement to the prevention process. And if we look at the compliance issue that you mentioned within the tick box side of things, we've created an environment where we're investing a lot of money in ticking the boxes, and we're now using technology to tick them quicker and more often. but we're not actually addressing money laundering, and we're not actually addressing the harm side of things. And in particular, the fines for breaching regulation tend to be applied to the shareholders of a current company for the misbehaviour of previous officers of the company who now left. So if you put it in terms of a simple example of driving a car and speeding, what we're doing is we're finding the manufacturer of the car because the driver was driving too fast and the driver walks away. So we don't really understand enforcement, we don't see the benefit of it, and we're just not doing enough of it.
Oh, sorry. I was just, it's probably quite a question, but so you talk a lot about corruption. I just wondered, I was just thinking about the word corruption and our relationship with it domestically. So I have a friend who works for is now a civil servant in Albania. And she sort of talks a lot about how they have a lot of anti-corruption training. That's quite a big thing they've moved towards. And talking about corruption is quite an open thing. Whereas here we tend to use other terms for things that, would be the same thing. I just wondered whether you think that we do have a difficult relationship with the word corruption in this country, and whether actually we need to be more blatant about calling certain things corruption.
I mean, again, it's that's a national question, but I'm going to give a brief answer. The book talks about the Transparency International definition of corruption, which is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. So it's not necessarily about public officials, which is different from the World Bank definition, which talks about public officials. And the solution from the World Bank perspective is to do more privatization, because then you have less public officials doing corruption, which I'm not sure is the answer. I don't think we address corruption enough in this country. The reason is because we have created a system in this country where anything that is corruption is described as something else wherever possible. And there's actually a paper published on the Sussex University site by me, which talks about why there are so few corruption cases in this country, but it's not really covered in the book. So I should move on. We could talk afterwards.
I actually did a masterclass, two sessions earlier on, about a whole new system for the financial system, because we don't measure value. The current system just measures it one to the point of sale. I mean, the system that measures value created throughout society, and it ties in. You can tie it to cryptocurrencies in the stable coins as opposed to Bitcoins, where you've got an underlying asset, and you tie the blockchain, the assets into the blockchain. So there's a trace of the transaction forever, but it's not going to change. So it's much easier to verify misuse. So the question is, I think the system needs a radical change. And my system that suggests is very valuable. Yes.
Well, I mean, I know that there are people working in the confiscation space who are looking at how you use blockchain linked to cryptocurrencies in order to freeze assets and to confiscate them.
Yeah.
So I know that work is going on in the government sector. And I think the experts who work in the government sector in that space are actually very good. I used to be in charge of cybercrime in Scotland Yard. The experts are great, good quality, as are the money laundering investigators. There's just not enough of them. Quite simple.
We've got Eva again online, and then a colleague at the back. I've also got a couple of questions. We're going to try and wrap up by 15:15. Is that right? So we've still got 5 minutes or so. Eva, relating to your point about cooperation between different government agencies is famously difficult to achieve. Most stories of policy failures seem to relate to cooperation failures in one way or another. how can it be encouraged and facilitated in the global context of anti-money laundering?
I think there's a couple of answers. One is that the European Union provides a good model, and I talk about the European Union and its effort to cooperate better across borders, and in particular, they've got a structure called joint investigation teams, which operates as a legal umbrella to allow European Union members and third countries to operate under a legal umbrella. So they're not working with the normal mutual legal assistance treaty process. They're working within a mutual legal umbrella. So I think this can be dealt with in that kind of environment, and I think that more should be done to achieve that. Having said that, the European Union's on its sixth money laundering directive, which is not a sign of success. It's a sign of failure, really. So I do think this is a complicated problem for lawyers to solve. It would be much easier if we all went back to basics and wrote one money laundering offence that's the same, using the same words in every criminal code. And then we could seamlessly make money laundering requests from one country to another in the same way I transferred the apple earlier. So we both understand exactly what that offence is, and then we can add the particular offence of extortion or kidnapping or whatever it is to that request. But at least we've started with money laundering as this amazing versatile offence in our international requests. And one of the things I didn't mention was money laundering may not be the prosecution objective, but it's a really useful investigation objective because it allows you to think as wide as possible at the beginning of an inquiry. Now, you might end up with a prosecution for the predicate offence without money laundering. But if you start with money laundering as an investigation tool, then you're bringing into it all the powers of the financial intelligence units, the powers of financial investigators in other countries who can only help you if it's called money laundering. If it's called theft or extortion, they can't help you because they're not allowed to. So you bring in some extra laws and extra skills if you look at everything from a money laundering perspective. And that's a technical answer for the lawyers and prosecutors who might be listening.
And clearly that's in your book as well.
Yeah, it's in the book as well.
Very good. At the back? Yeah.
Oh, hi there. It's really interesting what you're saying. I'm about to start a really big project that's looking at crime and poverty.
All right, okay.
Which will include an element of money laundering, I'm sure. But it's looking very locally, and it really piques my interest when you're talking about multi-agency working.
Yeah.
Because I'm imagining that we're going to we'll be working with police, trading standards, environmental health professionals, public housing benefit fraud.
Yeah.
And that networking approaches will be the best way to go forward. Have you got any kind of understanding of actually what makes a network really work and what makes it fail?
Okay, in this context, where we're talking about criminal investigation and criminal prosecution, the key is to have a top police officer and a top prosecutor, ideally in the same room, and if not that, officers next door to each other, so that they work together. And this is a global answer, not just a UK answer, but in your local area, there will be a regional asset recovery team, which will have that feature, prosecutor and a top cop in the same room. And that is the key to this. And then you bring in trading standards and the environmental agency, ideally on a permanent basis, rather than temporary. And that's another issue. We need permanent multi-agency teams as opposed to temporary ones brought together for some terrible crime. And one of the issues on a global area, looking at the corrupt theft of money from underdeveloped states, is that once the money's gone, they bring in a lot of experts to find where the money's gone. Well, it's hard to think of a more expensive and wasteful process than that. Because what you need is that multi-agency team already in existence that can act straight away and is already a team. And team building is a thing that takes time, as we will all appreciate. It takes even longer in the the criminal justice world because nobody trusts each other. And that's a sad reality. That's why we need to work together on a permanent basis.
Cool, thank you. Thank you. Can I fire up a couple
Yeah,
of questions?
cool.
But first question, the link between this global war and everything you described and you know, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals more broadly sort of described, you know, so we've got, you know, everything from environmental damage, inequality, poverty, eradicating poverty, etc., etc. So where does this fit in the broader campaign and war against all of those things in the world?
And I think in all of those areas that you're describing, there will be regulations. And the ultimate regulation is one that actually alters the behavior of the people who are breaching the regulations. So we're entering that area between regulatory breach and crime. And if you have no enforcement at the top, then actually you've got nothing, is my answer to that question. So you've got to have a regime which recognizes that there are some areas where you've just got to arrest and prosecute people. And at the moment, in many countries, in the money laundering space, we never prosecute bankers at all. Because so there's nothing up there. There's nothing keeping a lid on that particular area. And all of those areas that you're talking about have a regulatory response. It needs to have that top level. You know, what do we do with the people who won't pay attention and they need to be arrested?
Do you think some of these other areas in global, the grand challenges that we talk about all the time, can be addressed if this is addressed?
Yeah, we want people to behave correctly. We want them to do their bit in whatever their sphere of work is. But if they're misbehaving or they're abusing their trust that they've been given, then we need to have somebody who's going to come along and arrest them if they need to be arrested. And if you don't have that vertical control, then actually you end up with a lawless area in whatever your particular interest is.
I have another question, if I may. Is that okay? A little bit more sort of personal question. I mean, you've been talking so far about the topic, the substance, the book, etc. And we're interested in our masterclass speakers as well. And you mentioned that after graduating from York, you know, you went to South London to solve crime in South London, and then many years later, you're taking this very global view. Yeah. So I'm quite interested in that. So starting out with local crime and street level in, I don't know, Peckham or somewhere, and now you're taking a global view of systemic change that's needed. At what point did you realize this is a global issue that you want to battle against? Was it something that you saw early on? This is international, or was it something that dawned on you later on? Where did it fit into your career path?
Yeah, what a great question. I do think that there's a lot of nonsense taught about people who tackle serious and organised crime, to say that only real experts can deal with serious organised crime, serious organised detectives who can deal with that. And my experience is that if you're going to take out a serious organised criminal, then the way that actually works is that they're the king in the castle, typically a man, often assisted by a woman doing the money laundering, incidentally, or the mother-in-law. And there is a bit in the book about it talks about the mother-in-law as being the obvious place where the money goes, because it's a way to control the money by an emotional connection, by pleasing the wife, by pleasing the mother-in-law. It's the sort of psychology of it. And that's backed up by a whole load of cases where it's the mother-in-law who's got the money. So if you're going to take on organised crime of that nature, then you don't attack the castle head on. You attack the supply lines, and you attack the associates, and you take out the couriers, and you take out all the junior people. And you do that using uniform cops and ordinary policing, or the environmental agency, or the trading standards bodies. You use those multi-agency approaches to tackle this particular problem. And What you don't do is create one single agency that has a particular skill. You use all the skills you've got across your agencies to take a multifaceted approach to a common problem. And a lot of the cases I dealt with when I was working at Scotland Yard had actually been initiated by a uniformed police officer who in those days were well paid, well trained, connected to a good intelligence system that fed into the skilled people who could use it at Scotland Yard. And that connection from the street to Scotland Yard or the National Crime Agency is completely critical for success in this area. And people in places like Scotland Yard don't say that, because they say, well, it was Scotland Yard, it was, we are the great detectives. Well, yeah, we are, but actually we rely on a system which is professional throughout. Otherwise, it doesn't work, and you end up in a country in other countries where they don't have a strong police institution and they don't have this intelligence connection. They just can't deal with any sort of crime, never mind grand corruption. So you've got to get the basics right, including the traffic cops. Get that right, and then everything else will flow for the better.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just come back slightly, going back to what you said.
Yeah.
You talked about taking out the communication, the people that deal on the street and through to the top man. But earlier you said that only a very small percentage of the amount of money or assets that are available are actually seized.
Yes.
And isn't that one of the issues that we still face? That we may take out the lower level criminals who are acting with the top man, but we still fail to get to the top man.
Yeah, I think there's a degree of short-termism in law enforcement and short-termism in regulatory matters. And I think that needs to be managed carefully. Is my answer. We need to be more professional about it. But the taking out of the couriers is too often seen as an end in itself. And it isn't an end in itself, it's a clue for what happens next. In the area of cash, for example, in a lot of countries, if you cross the border, you fill out a form to say, I'm carrying more than 10,000 euros or $15,000, whatever the amount is. And that form is filled out on the border, and that's it. It eventually gets sent to the Financial Intelligence Unit. It's a paper system. Takes a while, but some customs services have no investigative capacity at all. They don't do it at all. So they don't have detectives at all in many customs areas in Europe, never mind in the rest of the world. So we're not joined up, and we don't do that well enough. And again, it's an issue of resources, but it's also an issue of calling law enforcement and the criminal justice system to account for what they do.
We've got one more question online, and then Andrew, and then I think we'll close. I'm sure there's lots of opportunity to sort of chat with Tristram afterwards, and of course, well, the book is probably got a lot of answers too, and as you can see there, 50% discount for us, guys. That's when you order it via the website, is it?
Via the website using that code, and it's time limited for obvious reasons.
Until what was it?
19th March.
19th of March.
Yeah,
so that's like a really good deal. Really good deal. Anyway, Caroline Hunter online. As someone currently trying to sell a house, I am having to provide lots of paperwork because of money laundering. Do you worry about losing public support for money laundering if day-to-day transactions become too difficult?
Yes, I don't. I think it's an issue of the narrative. And we all come across money laundering where an aged relative is suddenly faced with not having access to their bank account because they have to go in person to a bank branch that's actually now many miles away. These are box-ticking exercises which don't do anybody any good, and they do give a confusing narrative because it suggests that all of that process is important. And this book is intended to correct and say, well, actually, this is about things that seem simple and perhaps unimportant, like, I don't know, water purification. Well, we're now experiencing in the UK what happens if you don't take water regulation seriously. And that is around money laundering, and it is nothing to do with the kind of box ticking exercise that she's referring to there, which I don't think contributes usefully to the system.
Okay, good comment, thank you.
Just to repeat Chris's question, what way you go from local issue to the global issue?
Oh, well, the circumstances I had, when the Proceeds of Crime Act became law in the UK, I was on the National Committee. I didn't know I was going to be there for the next 10 years. So I did everything that I could do at a strategic level. I was in operational command of all the financial investigators. Then I was changing the Metropolitan Police approach. At the beginning, I'd been in charge of 25 people. By the end, there were 375 people working dedicated to financial investigation. And then I went to the International College to provide a UK interest to the world, that being that I would train financial investigators in other countries where we wanted to do inquiries so that they could do our job more effectively. Because obviously we have no jurisdiction in foreign countries, so we train them to help us solve our crimes. And so I did that from 2009. And then I retired from the police in 2012 and did that in my own company for the next decade, doing exactly the same thing. And I've had the privilege to travel Africa and the Caribbean and all over Europe, around about 40 jurisdictions, I can't lose count. And again and again, finding the same issues, the same generic issues. And I thought, actually, I don't want to do this traveling anymore, just read chapter 9. And the rest of them.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, quite an interesting talk, and thanks for your questions. And I'm sure there's lots of topics we could discuss. How to improve our collaboration between agencies, who should take leadership in this reform, supposed reform, and so on. What is the sequence of events? Who should do what, and get a whom precisely to get to where you suggest we should get to. But yeah, unfortunately, time is limited. But well, we can continue.
Yeah. It's been an absolute pleasure, Slobodan. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris, for the opportunity to speak to you, and thank you for the questions.
Yeah. Thanks. So that's